It was a Tuesday evening when my brother texted me. I was sitting at my kitchen table finishing a deposition summary, highlighter in one hand, cold coffee in the other. The kind of evening that sounds boring until you realize boring is what keeps everything together. The text said, "Grab that little drive off your desk. Needed something to store my band demos. You weren't using it anyway. Thanks, sis." There was a thumbs up emoji at the end. I read it twice. Then I set down the highlighter very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands want to do something else entirely. My brother had been in my apartment. He still had the spare key I gave him 8 months ago when I asked him to water my plants while I was in Chicago for a deposition. I never asked for it back. That was my first mistake, and I knew it the moment I read his message. I got up from the table and walked to my home office. The small black drive that had been sitting next to my laptop was gone. In its place, a faint ring of dust where it had been sitting for the past 3 weeks. That drive was not mine to lose. I work as a paralegal at a mid-sized litigation firm. I have been there for 6 years, and in those 6 years I have never once brought anything home that I wasn't supposed to. But 3 weeks ago, our lead attorney handed me that drive personally and told me to review the files on it over the weekend because the case was moving faster than expected. It contained scanned financial records, internal communications, and a set of transaction logs tied to a civil fraud case involving a regional construction company. The plaintiff was seeking just over $4 million in damages. The drive had been given to me under the firm's chain of custody protocol, which meant my name was on the log, my signature, my responsibility. I did not text my brother back right away. I sat at my desk and stared at the empty space where the drive had been, and I thought about the exact weight of what had just happened. Those files were protected under attorney-client privilege. Removing them from the chain of custody, even accidentally, was a serious breach. If that drive had been accessed by anyone outside the firm, if any of those documents had been copied or viewed without authorization, it could compromise the entire case. It could expose the firm to sanctions. It could cost someone their career, and that someone had my name on a log. I picked up my phone and called my direct supervisor, not because I wanted to, but because that was the only correct thing to do. She answered on the third ring. I told her exactly what happened. I did not soften it, did not frame it as a maybe or probably. I said the drive is missing and I believe my brother took it. I believe it happened within the last few hours. I have not contacted him yet. There was a pause on the line. Then she said, "Get it back tonight, and I need you in my office first thing tomorrow with a full written account." I said yes. Then I called my brother. He answered like nothing was wrong. Like it was any other call. "Hey, what's up?" I kept my voice level. I told him I needed the drive back. Tonight. That it was not mine. That it belonged to the firm. That it contained confidential documents he should not have touched. He laughed a little. "Relax, I just grabbed it for the demos. I didn't open any of your work stuff." "How would you know?" I said, "unless you looked." A pause. "Okay, I see like one folder. It's just some scanned papers. I didn't read them." I told him not to open anything, not to plug it into another device, not to send anything from it, and that I would be at his apartment in 30 minutes. He said I was overreacting. I hung up and grabbed my keys. His apartment is 20 minutes away in a neighborhood he could only afford because our parents helped with the deposit, which they did quietly and without mentioning it to me until 3 months later. That was a pattern in our family. Things happened around my brother that were smoothed over, explained away, contextualized until they became reasonable. He had always been like this, not malicious, just careless in a way that everyone around him had decided to absorb. He borrowed money and paid back half. He lost things that didn't belong to him and replaced them with apologies. He showed up late to things that mattered and early to things that were fun. He was charming enough that most people just exhaled and moved on, and our family had been exhaling for years. I was different. I had to be. I learned early that in my field you do not get to be careless. Documents don't disappear because you meant well. Deadlines don't move because something came up. Privilege doesn't stay intact because you had good intentions. He opened the door in a band t-shirt, barefoot, holding a beer. He looked genuinely confused about why I was there. I held out my hand. He went to get it from his desk without argument, which told me he didn't really understand what he had done. He came back and placed it in my palm like it was a USB stick he borrowed to transfer a playlist. I checked it. It looked undamaged. I asked him to pull up his laptop so I could see whether he had accessed any files. He got annoyed. I told you I didn't read anything. I said I need to verify that for the written report I have to file tomorrow morning. He looked at me for a moment, and then something shifted in his face. Not guilt, exactly. More like the first inklings of scale. He got the laptop. He had opened the drive. He had not opened any individual documents, but the access log showed the drive had been recognized by his system, and the folder structure was visible. That was enough to require disclosure. I took a photo of his screen, noted the timestamp, and left without staying for dinner, which he had awkwardly offered while I was still crouched in front of his laptop. That night I wrote the incident report. 3 pages, single-spaced, time-stamped, detailing every action I had taken from the moment I noticed the drive was missing. I emailed it to my supervisor at 11:47 p.m. with the subject line, "Full account, chain of custody incident." Then I sat on my couch and felt the specific exhaustion of having done the right thing when the wrong thing would have been so much easier. The meeting the next morning was not pleasant. My supervisor was professional and thorough, which was actually harder to sit through than anger would have been. She walked through the incident report with me line by line. She asked whether the drive had been connected to another machine for any length of time. She asked whether I had any reason to believe the files had been viewed or copied. She called in the firm's IT security consultant, a quiet man named Gerald who came in with a hard drive reader and spent 40 minutes examining the drive while I sat at the conference table and stared at the wall. Gerald confirmed that no files had been copied or transmitted. The folder had been browsed at the directory level, but no individual documents had been opened. He called it a low-impact access event and put it in writing. That was the first full breath I took in 16 hours. But low impact didn't mean no impact. My supervisor explained that the breach still needed to be disclosed to the lead attorney, who would decide whether to inform the client. It would go into my personnel file. She told me she appreciated that I had reported it immediately and completely, and that this mattered in how the firm would handle it going forward. Then she asked how my brother had gotten into my apartment. I told her about the spare key. She nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are being careful about what they say next. She said, "You might want to address that." I said I was planning to. The lead attorney, a woman who had been practicing law for longer than I had been alive, called me into her office that afternoon. She had already read Gerald's report and my incident account. She sat across from me without any papers in front of her, which I had learned meant she was thinking rather than reviewing. She said, "You did exactly what you were supposed to do." She said the breach was minor and that Gerald's confirmation protected the chain of custody going forward. She said the client would be informed as a matter of protocol, not because there was genuine risk, but because transparency was non-negotiable. Then she said something that stayed with me. She said the most dangerous people in a firm are not the ones who make mistakes. They are the ones who hide them. I left her office with a formal written caution in my file, and the quiet understanding that I had kept my job by being honest about losing control of something I should have protected better. My brother didn't find out about any of this until 3 days later. He had texted twice in the meantime. Once to ask if everything was okay. Once to say he was sorry if he'd caused stress, that he hadn't realized it was a big deal. I didn't respond to either. On Friday evening I called him. I told him what had happened. Not in summary, in full. I told him about the meeting with my supervisor, the IT forensic examination, the disclosure to the lead attorney, the client notification, the formal caution in my personnel file. I told him that the breach was classified as low impact, which was the only reason I still had a job, and that the difference between low impact and career ending had come down to whether he happened to click on a folder or a file. The phone was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't know." "I know you didn't know," I said. "That's actually part of the problem." He asked if he needed to do anything. Apologize to someone. Come in and explain. I told him that wasn't how this worked, that this wasn't a personal conflict that could be smoothed over with a conversation, that what he had done had entered a formal record and sat in a file with my name on it. He was quiet again. Then he said, "I really thought it was just a blank drive. I told him that was the point. He assumed. He walked into my apartment and took something off my desk without asking, without knowing what it was, without considering that my life and my work might have boundaries. He didn't have the information to understand. And he did it casually, like he had done 100 times before, because no one had ever made him stop. I told him I was having my locks changed on Saturday. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, okay. I had expected pushback. Instead, there was just that single word, and something in the way he said it told me the weight was finally landing. My parents called Sunday. My mother started with, "Your brother feels terrible. He's been moping all week." I said I understood. She said, "But it was an accident. He didn't mean to cause problems." I said I know he didn't mean to. I also know that my professional record now has a formal incident notation in it because of something he did without asking. Meaning and consequences are two different things. My father said, "You couldn't have just handled it quietly?" I asked him what quietly would have looked like. Not telling my supervisor? Not filing the report? Hoping no one noticed the access log? He didn't have an answer to that. I told them I didn't do this to punish my brother. I did it because those were the rules I operate under. The same rules that make me trustworthy enough to be handed sensitive documents in the first place. If I had hidden it, I would have been the one who violated the protocol, not just someone who reported a breach. My mother said she just didn't want things to be strange between us. I said they wouldn't be, but they were going to be different. My brother called me the following Wednesday. This time he didn't open with a joke or a deflection. He just said, "I've been thinking about what you said." I told him I was listening. He said he had been talking to a friend who worked in IT, and that the friend had explained what attorney-client privilege actually was, and what could happen when protected materials were accessed without authorization. His voice was different, less casual, like someone who had spent a week sitting with something uncomfortable instead of finding a way around it. He said, "I didn't understand what you actually did at work. I knew you were a paralegal, but I kind of thought it was just filing and scheduling. I didn't realize you were trusted with things that had that kind of weight." I told him I had tried to explain it before. He said he knew. He said he hadn't been listening. We talked for almost an hour. Not about the incident, really, about the longer pattern underneath it, the borrowed things that came back damaged or not at all. The way he had always assumed my space and my stuff were available because I had never drawn a hard enough line. The way our family had quietly reinforced that by always asking me to let things go. He asked if I was angry at him. I said I wasn't angry. I was tired, and I was done letting tired be enough reason to keep absorbing things. He asked what he could do. I told him to start by understanding why it mattered. Not because I needed an apology that came with conditions, but because the next time he reached for something that wasn't his, I wanted him to pause long enough to ask. He said he could do that. I believed him more than I expected to. The formal caution stayed in my file. That part didn't go away. But 6 weeks after the incident, the lead attorney assigned me to assist on a larger case, one with more complexity and more responsibility than anything I had handled before. She didn't say it was because of how I had handled the breach. She didn't say it was because of how I had handled the breach. She didn't have to. There is a particular kind of credibility that comes from being the person who reports a problem instead of hiding it. It doesn't feel good in the moment. It feels like handing someone a reason to question you. But what it actually does is show people what you will do when things go wrong. And in a field where everything eventually goes wrong, that matters more than a clean record. My brother and I had dinner the following month. He came over, brought food, knocked instead of letting himself in. We didn't talk about it directly. But at one point during dinner, he asked about the case I was working on. And I told him a little about it. Nothing privileged, just the general shape of it. The kind of work it involved. He listened in a way he hadn't before. Asked actual questions. Not polite ones, real ones. At the end of the night, he said, "I'm sorry it took something like this for me to take your work seriously." I told him it was okay. Not in the way I used to say it, where okay meant I'll absorb this. In the way that means it's in the past and we're standing somewhere new. He hugged me on the way out, longer than usual. I stood in the doorway after he left and thought about the drive sitting on my desk 3 months ago. Something the size of a thumb, containing $4 million worth of someone's legal future, sitting out in the open because I'd gotten comfortable. That was on me. I'd let the line between home and work blur because nothing bad had ever happened before. My brother had walked through that blur and grabbed something without thinking because nobody had ever made him think. We both had something to learn. His lesson was louder. Mine was quieter. But it was there. I went back to my desk, opened my laptop, and finished the brief that was due in the morning. The lock on my door was new, the spare key was gone. And for the first time in a long time, the boundary between my life and the rest of the world was exactly where it was supposed to be. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what actually happened that Tuesday, and the more I sit with it, the more I realize it wasn't really about a drive. It was about years of small things that I let slide because the cost of making them into something bigger always felt higher than just absorbing them. A borrowed 20 that came back as 10. A key I gave for one reason that stayed in someone's pocket for 8 months. A pattern so familiar it had become invisible to me and to my brother both. When people talk about consequences, they usually mean punishment, something imposed from the outside to correct a behavior. But what I watched happen with my brother wasn't like that. The consequence wasn't the phone call I made or the formal caution in my file, or even the lock I changed on a Saturday morning. The consequence was understanding. And understanding, when it finally lands hard, not because someone forced it, but because you can't unknow something once you actually know it. My brother didn't mean to create a problem. That's the part I kept coming back to. He genuinely thought it was a blank drive. He genuinely thought my work was scheduling and filing. He genuinely thought borrowing without asking was a harmless shortcut because it had always been a harmless shortcut. In every context he'd ever tried it. Nobody had ever handed him a situation where the cost of assuming was visible and immediate and impossible to explain away. I don't think carelessness is a personality trait. I think it's what happens when someone never gets real feedback. My family had been protecting my brother from feedback for years. Not out of cruelty, but out of love that had gotten confused with rescue. Every time they asked me to let something go, they thought they were keeping the peace. What they were actually doing was teaching him that his actions didn't have weight. The thing about integrity, about the kind of discipline I had to build in order to do my job, is that it's not comfortable. It doesn't feel heroic in the moment. It feels like sitting at a desk at 11:45 at night, writing a 3-page incident report about something your brother did, because that's the only honest thing left to do. It feels like walking into a meeting the next morning and handing someone a reason to question you, because hiding it would have made you into something you couldn't come back from. I think about the lead attorney's words sometimes, that the most dangerous people aren't the ones who make mistakes. They're the ones who hide them. I've carried that with me in a way that has nothing to do with law and everything to do with how I want to live. Mistakes happen. What you do next is the only part that actually defines you. My brother and I are in a different place now. Not a perfect place, but a real one. He knocks, he asks, he listens when I talk about work in a way he never used to. None of that came from me punishing him. It came from him finally having to sit with something uncomfortable long enough to understand it. That, I think, is what growth actually looks like. Not transformation overnight. Just a person, slowly, choosing to become someone who pays attention.